Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Riprap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randy Baier, and we're going to talk about some academic books and academic issues. What I want to start with is the moral arc, how science and reason lead humanity toward truth, justice, and freedom by Michael Shermer. How's that for a big start?
That's a tome.
Yeah.
Even the thought concept is a tome. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. The meaning, according to morality.
Well, it's quite relevant.
I'm being facetious. I'm sure it's worth a read.
It is quite relevant, actually, because of all the events that have happened just the last couple months, where we had the shootings in Charleston and other things, and the point that he's making is that the moral arc, according to what Martin Luther King said and others like Theodore Parker, that ultimately it bends toward justice. And I think at this time in our nation's history we need to remember that, because they're talking here about a previous time in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, when they had the march and all the conflict there. And, it's just been devastating to watch this long series of things. But he says, my aim is to show that Reverends Parker and King were right, that the arc of the moral universe does indeed bend toward justice. In addition to religious conscience and stirring rhetoric, we can trace the moral arc through science with data from many different lines of inquiry, all of which demonstrate that in general, as a species, we are becoming increasingly moral. Well, and then,
what's our next book?
Beyond the Corporate University, Culture and Pedagogy in the New Millennium, edited by Giroux.
So how do we segue?
Well,
Henry Giroux, he's very well. Is this his latest book? He's very well known as a very progressive. I think we've reviewed another book by him.
Yeah.
He's very well known as a very progressive and, even leftist, I guess. But that's too cheap of a term. It's not adequate.
But what's interesting is this is in line with the moral arc point about
Read the title again. Sorry.
The title is Beyond the Corporate University, Culture and Pedagogy, the New Millennium. And what I find interesting about this is this is a somewhat earlier book, but the evolution based on this stance toward the university is now palpable and being felt by everyone who teaches.
Yeah.
For example, his introduction is called Critical Educational Training Beyond the Commodification of Higher Education.
Well, we might as well look like NASCAR drivers.
Yeah.
With we got Kraft cheese and Aramark and whatever. I don't know. Take your popular corporate labels and put them on Pepsi-Cola and others, maybe not so well known. But you got a bright. I'll get up and teach a class and wear a red jumpsuit with all these labels on me and say, "Guess where I'm from?"
NASCAR driver.
Yeah, I'm your next university teacher. And the other aspect of corporatism, I guess, is that, and I suppose you could bring it back to the moral arc. Well, what is the job, the duty, the responsibility of education? Is it to make people worker bees? Is that what we're supposed to be doing?
It's far worse than that, the corporatism. And he says, beset by the growing forces of neoliberalism and the raging politics of culture wars, progressive educators and advocates of democratic education are increasingly pressured to become either servants of corporate power or detached intellectuals defined by steadfast allegiance to the dictates of a narrow professionalism. There's the rub.
And the narrow professionalism is?
You just contract, rather than raise the questions that are going to stir up things, you just retract within your field.
You're trained to have the law work for the capitalists. And that's what you're training, that you come out graduated. I don't know if it's quite as cynical as that appears, but it's more and more difficult because of the money interest, the cost, the nature of the materials we read and we reflect on, and what we consider to be the proper attitudes towards action.
Well, and the point you're making about NASCAR professors, it actually discusses somewhat like that. This book takes as one of its central themes that education must not be confused with training, suggesting that educators resist allowing commercial values to shape the purpose and mission of higher education. And along with that, it shouldn't be a training ground for the corporate workforce, or, as Jeffrey Williams points out, a licensed storefront for name brand corporations like Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Yeah.
We're right there.
Yeah.
We're right there. But in the crucial values, it, meaning the university, represents for educating students for the demands and responsibilities of leadership, social citizenship, and democratic public life. That's, it's a big area of discussion right now. It's bearing fruit.
He's a very sharp thinker. I've heard him talk a couple times, and he has a lot to say about the nature of pedagogy as well, and critical thinking. I'm sure comes into his reflections in this book. Even on a daily level, the tension now between classroom outcomes and the educated thinking public. Faculty, or those who teach, I think, want there to be this, at least maybe in the American democratic context, they want there to be an intelligent, critically thinking public who can take an issue and look at the various sides and look at, the interests that different groups have in that, and look at a problem. But the pressure is to more and more, I don't mean to make this sound like I'm blaming attitudes of students, but much of the attitude of those who are coming into college, conditioned maybe by this corporate thinking, is that this is a contract now. You are supposed to do for me a certain thing because I'm paying for this. And that's a real tension right now.
The students don't see it as a struggle for critical thinking, for understanding, improving their understanding. It's just like, give it to me so
I will have something that, I'll have a certain base level of skills that I can then, get my good first job.
Or give me my hamburger, I'll get it on my way.
It's that way. And it is true that people are paying a lot to go to school. In fact, the debt is piling up, which is another crime of our particular education system. But to be challenged to think through a problem and face critique, right? Face critique. People need, in a sense, to work through that, and a lot of students and a lot of faculty too are not willing to do that now. It's a very practical thing.
It's not a transaction, it's just an interaction, just pallid, because it's just give me what I want, I'm on my way.
Yeah.
And what I've seen is the student's ability to think is becoming weaker and weaker. Mm-hmm. And their motivation.
But isn't that partly our fault as well? we're not setting a tone where that can we as teachers, I'm saying.
No, I think the students have to take responsibility for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They should be pushing the professors to get what they need.
Mm-hmm.
But because they have this mentality that they're going to McDonald's and they can just, the transaction, pay your money, get your hamburger and eat it.
Right.
They don't see why they should have to struggle. Why should I have to understand anything about it? I'm paying the money, give me my hamburger.
Even down on the level of art, I have a colleague who teaches ceramics. Ceramics is very, obviously, literally a hands-on art. But there's that thing about art that says you need to put literally time, the 10,000 hours, you know, writing, making pots, painting, drawing, whatever, editing film. You need time because you have to work at it over and over again. The magic of creativity comes in some sense through the work. But it's very true in ceramics. You have to mold the mud, right? But there is a trend that she's been telling me about. People coming in and they want to be able to, you know, make wonderful things right off the bat. They want quick solutions. They don't want critique. They want to know how to make something fast so that, you know, whatever, I don't know. And the patience it takes to say, okay, this is the introduction. You've got 4 months. You might end up with one wonderful something you made at the end of this time. But you just have to do it a little at a time every day and work that way. It's not something that's inculcated into, you know, our generation in some ways.
I tell my students on the very first day they can expect to have to revise their papers 2, 3, 4, or 5 times.
That must shock them, right?
It's shocked. What's even weirder that I've discovered, they're not listening.
I mean, that in a sense shocks me. I've learned that over the years. I mean, you learn that redoing is the magic of
but what shocks me is they're not listening.
They're not hearing that.
I had a student this past week where I said, you know, you need to do a scratch outline. Well, what's that? I said, it's in the syllabus. And I pointed it out to everybody on the first day of class.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't find it in the syllabus. I mean, this is incompetence writ large. So I showed him.
Mm-hmm.
I said, that's what you've got to do. So they don't read, they don't listen, they don't interpret.
So that's an indictment, but isn't that an indictment on, I'm taking the bleeding heart liberal point of view, isn't that in many ways, our own fault? I mean, in the collective society, not you and me as educators.
No, but I think the students, what I worry about is the students have to take ownership.
Yeah.
And I tell them on the first day, you're expected to take ownership of your learning. I'm not going to spoon feed you. If you have questions, come to me and I'll help you find the answer.
Help you explore it a
but
little.
You need to do the work. The other thing that's alarming to me is I tell them all repeatedly that for college level work, you need to put 2.5 hours of prep per hour of class. So in a class of an hour and a half, it's 4 hours of prep time. And they'll tell me, I don't have time for that.
And they don't. Actually, it's true.
Well, they do, but they're going to have to cut out some of the peripheral activities.
A lot of the students at Eastern here in our area, they literally don't have time. They've confused time, in a sense. Not confused. They need a job. Maybe they don't need the fancy car. I don't know. I don't know if it comes down to they need the job in order to get money to waste the money on, you know.
Well, they don't waste money. But
I think a lot of them have serious issues where they have to earn the money they're earning. And
yeah, but what they regard as mandatory is phone, car, apartment of their own, all these costs that are not mandatory. And that if they were tougher minded, they'd say, well, you know, this is what I have to do.
But we've allowed that to happen. I mean, we've allowed ATMs to take over our life, where the cell phone industry, we have said as a society, this is what we want. Our kids have grown up feeling that that's a necessary part of human communication. We remember a time when it wasn't, but why would we blame them for that? Because we've created, we've met the enemy, and it is us.
It's them. They need to take ownership of the learning process. I can't do that for them. They need to do it themselves. I'm telling them that. I mean,
Right.
And so what's interesting to me is that it looks like my classes are pretty relaxed. Well, they are, but there's a very specific number of tasks
Right.
that are supposed to be done at a certain...
Right. No, it sounds like you break things down into the component parts where success can happen if you follow
But one thing
follow the Zen master.
This past midterm, I gave whole classes D's.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, you didn't do your essay. And I told you on the first day you have to do the essay because
Mm-hmm.
that's 60% of your grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done that deliberately because this is an academic essay writing class.
So what do the corporate pedagogists tell you? Does the dean call you in and say, why does your whole class get D's?
No.
You got a bell curve that's heavy on the low
Well, I
end?
got the details. So if I've had 4 students appeal the D's they got as a
Mm-hmm.
semester.
The rest realize that,
And the appeals were not sustained.
yeah.
None of them.
But I would love to hear what Giroux has to say about this very argument that we're having, because I think he's completely right about the way the corporate model is taking over.
Well,
I mean, I see it at my own institution.
he says the new corporate university appears to be indifferent to ideas, forms of learning, and modes of research that lack commercial value.
Yeah.
And along with that, they've even, companies have even censored corporate-sponsored research papers. Well, anyway, the point is there's penalties for people who don't follow this model.
Yeah.
And I think this is just fascinating. This is relevant. At stake here is the attempt to rethink what it means for critical educators to produce knowledge, social relations, and modes of authority capable of challenging those forms of moral and political regulation that perceive higher education as both a training ground for corporate births and as a guardian of dominant cultural capital designed to benefit a small, privileged minority of ruling class students. That's what this is, incredible.
Some of that critique is extremely valuable and true, and others of it might be interpreted based on, it's ironic to criticize him on a class argument, but and he comes from a knowledgeable, class-sensitive background. But if you look at the class difference of universities, private schools, well-endowed private universities and whatnot, even public universities like the University of Michigan, it really comes down to a class issue. I think some of these critiques, the corporate critique, especially on the students, it's not really there. They don't have the ability to take on that kind of control over the corporate interests that are controlling the university now.
Well, one thing is that your apparent definition of pedagogy is something Giroux agrees with.
Mm-hmm.
That he's looking at the centrality of pedagogy as a moral and political practice. Though they take up what it means to be the pedagogical, more political in different ways, but still it's a moral and political practice. And that what we need is transformative pedagogy that relentlessly questions the kinds of labor practices, effective investments, and forms of production that are enacted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think there's this more aggressive version of pedagogy than just getting up there reading the notes and posting the notes and walking out of the room.
That's very true.
And I agree.
Well, it's based on the question authority in a lot of ways, on a very simple principle. But if you're really truly going to question authority, and I don't know if I do, you have to keep you first of all have to be willing to get fired, and secondly, you have to be willing to question the question. You know, you're questioning the authority. It's turtles all the way down. You have to keep going.
There's an author of a chapter called "The University: A Place to Think," critiquing the explosion of the use of the web.
Yeah.
Because now, if it's on the web, it supposedly is an authority.
Right.
I don't allow that in my class. I don't allow any online sources.
Right.
But he says, surfing through a variety of university homepages, one cannot help but notice the wide variation in image texts. Where you saw this kind of malarkey of the pleasant green place.
Oh, I mean, this
smiling.
It's all enticement to come to their college. Yeah. I mean, but that's the nature
marketing.
of branding. I mean, that's where we're at with branding today. There's nothing surprising about that, but the interesting thing, I guess, if you look at the title, the corporate, he's talking about branding, and in the book he's talking about the corporate university. So there is this melding of, and maybe that's what he's onto. If you look at the visual universe of advertising, and the visual universe of university websites or university marketing, or an academic department at a university creates an annual report. And I mean, if you put it next to the Ford Motor Company and what Halliburton is now called, some innocent name you'd never know it was Halliburton, and you put the department of the library of the university, their annual report, they look exactly the same. There is a sort of a unification of visuality there that really makes it look incredibly corporate. You can go to the website, these fancy websites of Kentucky Fried Chicken you mentioned, and I mean, in some ways, you're in the same plaza as the University of Arizona, or Arizona State.
Here's an interesting question. A university without heroes? The three alibis, he's talking about alibis, I've presented are each rationalities underscoring particular forms of pedagogic action. Rationalities that articulate heroic subject positions as essential to their successful enactment. Maybe that's what not is necessary.
He wants a university without heroes?
No, people, everybody. A heroic thing is an elevated stance.
Right, standing up to some.
Who decides that's a hero?
Yes, very true. That's a great question.
People who are in the society who subscribe what the qualities are of a hero.
Those who are identified as, look at Charleston today, or all across the South. The whole issue is, at what point the monuments of the past, right? They're stone. They're so emplaced, and they're so permanent, quote unquote permanent. They represent heroes of obviously a different time, when the values of that particular moment were establishing these people as heroes.
As shown by the debate about taking down the Confederate flag.
Yeah, exactly. The flag is, what do they call the doomsday people? The right-wing conservative doomsday people are saying this is the slippery slope. You'll start at the flag, and the next thing, Colonel Mason on the town square of, wherever, somewhere in Tennessee, they're going to take it down now, because it represents the same treachery of the times.
By the way, there really is no such thing as the Confederate flag. There's a battle flag of a specific regiment or battalion that became what was known as the Confederate flag.
Yes, that's exactly what it is, but what does that prove? I mean, you might as well call it the Confederate flag, because that's language. I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, it doesn't make it any less of an icon, does it? By knowing the specific history of the flag itself.
Well, it shows the inflated worth that people assign to it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying it was merely an ensign for a troop.
Right.
Army of Northern Virginia was not a small. I mean, it was the army that fought at
But they tried to find
Gettysburg. I mean,
a symbol for the Confederacy.
Right.
There wasn't any available. So
well, what is that called? Metonymy or something? Like you say, it represents the smaller represents the whole.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's metonymy.
But I find it fascinating that something that never a symbol of the entire Confederacy became a symbol for the entire Confederacy to the point that people give their lives for it. When it wasn't, it was just for that one regiment.
Well, you could say the same thing for okay, I'll argue with you on this. I don't think that's necessarily the most important point because small things become big things because of whatever folklore culture they get elevated and then you got a big thing. I mean, you could say the same thing about the Star-Spangled Banner. You know, a drinking song or the Battle Hymn of the Republic. You know, I mean, any of those things that become.
But they're not on flagpoles.
But but they're inflated, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
They're, a folk song of drinking ballad becomes, a hymn. I mean, that's folklore.
In this chapter on the politics of teaching literature, the pedagogical effect by Robert McLitch, there's an interesting point. What's the difference between the politics of teaching and the teaching of politics? Huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
One doesn't require any position.
Right.
You just regurgitate all this
Teaching
stuff.
politics has a politics of teaching behind it, for sure. Yeah.
And they talk about self-reflexivity. But
well, how do you teach democracy? That's the teaching of politics, right? But there is a politics of teaching behind that concept. And I know that's true because weren't you and I talking about a book called World Englishes? Well, likewise, there's world democracies. The idea of, democracy gets completely reinterpreted depending on where you are.
But I just thought it's fascinating with this book because so much of it has come true.
He's very insightful. I find his writing, I've written other, read other things that he has written, and keep coming back to it. It's a very dense and thoughtful kind of writing, and part of the sort of progressive politics behind his writing, the class analysis takes me, anyway, a lot of sort of redoing to sort of understand the arguments.
This book, The Humanities, Higher Education, Academic Freedom, 3 Necessary Arguments, by Michael Berube and Jennifer Ruth.
Is this something you give to the incoming class of new faculty each year?
It's small and cheap. I don't know. And it says, this book charts a path out of the curdling academic labor system and toward a world in which academic freedom serves the public good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the question of the Western humanities all along, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, thank you for being on Riprap again.
This was a delight. Yeah. And we solved all the problems of the universe again. As usual. The art, we got it done.